Good morning. Everybody got quiet? We're continuing looking at Solomon this morning. Before we do, we'll do a little bit of background with David. So we talked about David the first half of this quarter, but there are some things we didn't go over that are relevant to what's going on with Solomon. So we'll start out this morning in 2 Samuel chapter 5, verses 11 and 12. It says, Then Hiram, king of Tyre, sent messengers to David, and cedar trees, and carpenters, and masons. And they built David a house, so David knew that the Lord had established him as king over Israel, and that he had exalted his kingdom for the sake of his people Israel. So not only was David a war hero, but we see here David formed alliances. We talked about that a few weeks ago as he was passing on words of wisdom to Solomon, telling him about alliances, told him to be good to or be friendly with the sons of Barzillai, the Gileadite, because he had helped David when David was fleeing from Absalom. And so here again we see, even though David was a war hero, he was big in battle, he also had alliances and people that were faithful to him. And so I find it interesting that David didn't ask the king of Tyre to give him help. The king sent word to him and said, I want to help you. And he sent him messengers and carpenters and masons. All of this was right after David was anointed as king. And so when he sent him help, Tyre was notorious at this time for elegant buildings. And so David knew that if this person's reaching out to help me and help me build a palace or a home, that God has established me as king of Israel. This was kind of just a little extra icing on the cake for him to make sure that he knew his reign as king was of God. He already knew that, but this was just a little bit extra to help. In the next chapter, chapter 6, we read about David trying to bring the ark to the city of David. But while moving the ark, the oxen kind of stutter, and Uzzah reaches up and grabs the ark, and what happens? God strikes him. It's considered disrespectful to touch the ark. And so God strikes him down. And so David gets a little bit worried. And David says, maybe I don't want the ark in the city of David right now. I don't know that I'm worthy to have it in my presence or with me or be in charge of it. And so he was scared. Right. He feared God. Right. And we'll see a contrast to that in Solomon later in the lesson today. Right. So David sends it off to the house of Obed-Edom. And while the ark is there, God blesses Oded, whatever his name is, I can't say it again, and blesses him and his whole household. And so David sees this, sees that God has blessed him, sees that he's blessed where the ark is, and so he's a little more comfortable. So after about 3 months, he says, okay, let's bring it on. So he brings it on to the city of David.
But this time, he says, you do what God said,
Right. So he gets there, David pitches a tent and puts the ark in a tent. So moving on to the next chapter, 2 Samuel chapter 7, the first 3 verses. Now it came about when the king lived in his house, and the Lord had given him rest on every side from all of his enemies, that the king said to Nathan the prophet, See now, I dwell in a house of cedar, but the ark of God dwells within tent curtains. Nathan said to the king, Go do all that is in your mind, for the Lord is with you. So David gets to a point, he finally has peace. He's not at war. He's not out on the battlefield. He looks up and sees this really nice place that he's living in, and he thinks, God's ark doesn't have a nice place that it's residing in. Is that something that God would find offensive? Is probably what he's thinking. He remembers when he brought the ark in, what happened when the ark was disrespected. And so I think David still got a little bit of that fear in him that, am I disrespecting God by living in this nice fancy palace and then his ark sitting there in a tent? But we read on in verses 4 through 7. It says, "But that night the word of the Lord came to Nathan, saying, 'Go tell my servant David, this is what the Lord says. Are you the one to build me a house to dwell in? I have not dwelt in a house from the day I brought the Israelites up out of Egypt to this day. I have been moving from place to place with a tent as my dwelling. Wherever I have moved with all the Israelites, did I ever say to any of their rulers whom I commanded to shepherd my people, why have you not built me a house of cedar? Now then, tell my servant David, this is what the Lord Almighty says. I took you from the pasture, from tending the flock, and appointed you ruler over my people Israel. I have been with you wherever you have gone, and I have cut off all of your enemies from before you. Now I will make your name great like the names of the greatest men on earth. And I will provide a place for my people Israel, and will plant them so that they can have a home of their own and no longer be disturbed. Wicked people will not oppress them anymore, as they did at the beginning, and have done ever since the time I appointed leaders over my people Israel. I will also give you rest from all your enemies. The Lord declares to you that the Lord himself will establish a house for you. When your days are over and you rest with your ancestors, I will raise you up. I will raise up your offspring to succeed you, your own flesh and blood, and I will establish his kingdom. He is the one who will build a house for my name, and I will establish the throne of his kingdom forever." So God sees David here, and he sees that his intentions probably are pure. David's probably wanting to do it for the right reasons. And so God answers David nicely and explains it with a lot of words in comparison to what we see God explain at other times. He reveals to David that his successor will be the one to build the empire. He asks him, "Are you the one to build my house?" And he reminds him, "I'm the one that brought you out of being a shepherd in the fields. I'm the one that made you king. I'm the one that told you to do all these things. Did I tell you to build me a temple?" And so he explains it to David to make sure David understands it's not disrespectful. He reminds him that the ark has lived in a tent for how long? Since it was made. Over 400 years. The ark has moved from place to place, and it's always been housed in a tent. So God wants David to know that it's not disrespectful, that God doesn't see it as disrespectful, but he does give him assurance that it will be in a temple, because I think he knows David wants it to be in a temple. He knows David wants to honor God by it being in a temple. And so he assures him that that will happen, but it'll be his successor that does that.
The place was God that said that he would show them that there will be a place where he would dwell. And he would show them what that place is.
Right.
And so, as they were moving along, that wasn't the place. But now God is choosing the place. As let them realize what the place is he showed.
And I think that's in the back of David's mind too, is knowing God's now established the kingdom. He's given Israel a king. And so if God's established that kingdom, then now should be the time that the temple would be built. Okay, so that gets us back to where we are today. We're going to move into 2 Chronicles. Last week we looked at chapter 1. Technically we looked in, I think it's 1 Kings chapter 3, where Solomon took his entire assembly, everybody that was a leader in Israel in any form or fashion, took them and up to the tabernacle and offered 1,000 sacrifices to God. So he wanted everybody to know that he was going to be faithful to Yahweh, just like his father David was. And so after that, God acknowledges Solomon's sacrifice by telling him to ask for whatever he wants. And so he asks for wisdom and knowledge to make him rule over God's people in a way that pleases God. So God grants him that, but also grants him what? Everything, wealth and power and honor, and makes him a great name among kings. So we'll start in 2 Chronicles chapter 2, verse 1. Now Solomon decided to build a house for the name of the Lord and a royal palace for himself. So what's the difference here between David and Solomon just from the start when they talk about building a house for the Lord? David was a warrior, okay. Also, David already was living in a house when the time he thought about it. He built his house already. Solomon says, I want to build a house. I don't know if his thought and what he said was in order of what the scripture says here, but the first one is, I want to build a house for the name of the Lord and a place for myself. And then we see as he goes on to build those two, which one does he build first? He builds the temple first. So he establishes the house for God, for the name of the Lord first. Why is it that Solomon needs a new palace? Why can't he stay in David's place? Why do kings? He has a lot more wives. That's part of it, right? Because as kings have more wives and they have more family and children, they need a bigger residence. And then also their brothers and sisters and their other family from their father had to have a place to stay too. So if they stayed in the same place, they would just kind of bust at the seams. But he knows that he's not going to do that anytime soon. So he builds the temple first, and then he builds his home next. All right, verse 2, and then we'll skip to verse 17 and 18, only because it's repeated. So Solomon assigned 70,000 men to carry loads and 80,000 men to quarry stone in the mountains and 3,600 to supervise them. Solomon numbered all the aliens or foreigners who were in the land of Israel, following the census which his father David had taken, and 153,600 were found. He appointed 70,000 of them to carry loads, and 80,000 to quarry stones in the mountains, and 3,600 supervisors to make the people work. And so it lists here, I don't really know why it lists it twice. I have no idea why the author decides to put it in there two different times. But there is a little more detail at the back end of it than there is at the beginning of it. The verses 17 and 18 tell us that these people that are building are what? They're aliens. They're foreigners. So they're not Israelites, at least the ones that are named here. This is an interesting verse because critics of the Bible love to find discrepancies. And so this is one of the verses that critics will come to and say, there's a discrepancy here because it also talks about this same thing in 2 Kings chapter 5. So here in this verse, it says that there's 3,600 supervisors to make people work. In 2 Kings chapter 5, verses 15 and 16, it says, Now Solomon had 70,000 transporters and 80,000 hewers of stone in the mountain. I don't know what version I got that from. Besides Solomon's 3,300 chief deputies who were over the project and who ruled the people who were doing the work. So it's the same set of people that he's talking about, but he says 3,300 in 2 Kings. A different author says 3,300 versus 3,600. So where's the difference there? Does anybody remember that?
One thing is that numbers notoriously in the Hebrew system were hard to get back.
Okay.
They did not have the Arabic system that we do. And so their way they listed and wrote numbers did not have.
So that's a possibility. Also, if you look at the way that the two chapters talk about them, 2 Chronicles comes back at the end and clarifies who they're talking about. And they're talking about aliens, foreigners. In 2 Kings, in 1 Kings, it talks about forced laborers or slaves. So there is a possibility that a subset of those were people that already worked for the king, and they were not forced laborers. They were the supervisors. They weren't, the tens of thousands that were doing the hard labor. They were the ones that were overlooking the work. And so it's very possible that 300 of them were people that already worked for David, and David assigned that work, but they were not considered forced labor. All that could be just speculation, but I'm a math guy, so I like to have numbers. So there's a better numbers explanation if you look at it. In Second Chronicles, later on in chapter 8, it's talking about the chief officers again and the ones that are left. And not scripturally supported, but legend has it that no Israelites died during the building of the temple. And so we would think that that number would be consistent from the beginning to the end. So in Second Chronicles chapter 8, verse 10, let me turn there. I thought I wrote it down. It says, these were the chief officers of King Solomon. 250 ruled over the people. So Second Chronicles was 3,600 at first. First Kings was 3,300. So First Kings was 300 short. If we look later in Kings, where's the reference? I think it's chapter 5. Yeah, First Kings chapter 5. Nope, sorry, that's the 3,300. First Kings chapter 9 has the same thing that Second Chronicles chapter 8 is talking about. And it lists, instead, when Solomon finished building the temple, it lists 550 remaining chief officers. And so it's the opposite. And so it's very obvious there that it's just a difference in what they're categorizing as who these men are. It's not a discrepancy in the numbers. If you add the two up, they both add up to 3,850. Even though that's not how that works, but they're accounting for these men in different categories. And so to me, that discrepancy is not a discrepancy. All right, let's move on in Second Chronicles chapter 2, verses 3 through 6. Then Solomon sent word to Hiram, king of Tyre, saying, as you dealt with David my father, and sent him cedars to build a house to dwell in, so do for me. Behold, I am about to build a house for the name of the Lord my God, dedicating it to him to burn fragrant incense before him, and to set out the showbread continually, and offer burnt offerings morning and evening, on Sabbaths and on new moons, and on the appointed feasts of the Lord our God. This being required forever in Israel. The house which I am about to build will be great, for greater is our God than all the gods. But who is able to build a house for him? For the heavens and the highest heavens cannot contain him. So who am I that I should build a house for him, except to burn incense before him? So at this point, Hiram had to be getting older, because he is the same king that had helped David out some 40 so years ago when David wanted to build a house. He provided lumber for David. There's also a difference here between David and Solomon. As I mentioned earlier, David didn't send for Hiram. Hiram sent a letter to David and went ahead and sent his men to help him build and help build his house. In this instance, Solomon sends for Hiram. So he knows that he is good at, his people are good at building, and he wants to make sure that the temple that he builds is the best quality temple possible. In his letter, he tells him that he's building a temple for who? Yeah, not for God. He says he's building a temple for the name of God, the name of Yahweh. Why is it important that he says the name versus the Lord? He explains it. What does he say? Right. And so he's setting Yahweh apart from all the other pagan gods. When they build a temple to worship the pagan gods and the gods are housed in the temple, he's saying Yahweh is not that. Yahweh is a true living God. Not even the heavens can contain him. And so the temple will really only be a place that we can go burn incense and sacrifices to him so that we can worship him. Stayed there. Right. All right, let's go to verses 7 through 10. Now send me a skilled man to work in gold, silver, brass, and iron, in purple, crimson, and violet fabrics, and who knows how to make engravings, to work with skilled men whom I have in Judah and Jerusalem, whom my father David provided. Send me also cedar, cypress, and algum timber from Lebanon, for I know that your servants know how to cut the timber of Lebanon, and indeed my servants will work with your servants to prepare timber in abundance for me, for the house which I'm about to build, which will be great and wonderful. Now behold, I will give your servants, the woodsmen who cut the timber, 20,000 cores of crushed wheat, 20,000 cores of barley, and 20,000 baths of wine, and 20,000 baths of oil. So Solomon is asking the king for his best of the best. And he doesn't just say the best of the best. He names off what he wants. He names off with the materials he wants: gold, silver, bronze, and iron. And then he goes on to list the colors that he deals with, which are all considered colors of royalty: purple, crimson. And then he talks.
These things were found in the tabernacle also. These colors and things. And he said he sent him for someone that's skilled in working, not to see the materials. Because back in 22, David, in First Chronicles 22, we see David preparing for the temple. All the gold and silver and all of this stuff that he had on the side, ready for Solomon.
Prepared.
And the Solomon in the days of Elijah, the second verse that David says, David preparing the house of praise. And people don't know about Solomon's building, but it talks about David making preparation.
Right. And dedicated things to the Lord before then. So right, Solomon wasn't against using the Israelites, but he was asking for help from these skilled workers, these people who were known and who had been doing it for years and years and years, longer than the Israelites. So he wanted to make sure that everything that was done was the best of the best.
When the tabernacle was built, God gave to men the ability to do all of these things with the Spirit. The Spirit gave them the knowledge to cut stone and to do all of these things. And when they taught
Trained.
the others there. And so at that time, God provided for it. And now Solomon knows who's good at it right now.
Right. And he asked for cedar and cypress from Lebanon. So he does ask for materials from wood, for Lebanon, just because it's known for good quality wood. And he wants to make sure that the wood that's in the temple is good quality. And then he goes on to make sure that Hiram knows he's not asking for a favor. He tells him what he's willing to pay the workers. And we know at this point, God has already blessed him with so many riches that Solomon is willing to put them to use to go into God's temple. In the next verses, Hiram responds. We won't go through all of those, but he responds with some flattery, and he agrees to the terms of the payment. And he also agrees to send his best craftsman, who is a descendant of both the Israelites and a descendant of Tyre. All right, let's turn over now. The book skips the building of the temple, so we'll skip a lot of that, but he goes through and he builds the temple. And then in chapter 5, starting in verses 1 through 5. Thus all the work that Solomon performed for the house of the Lord was finished. And Solomon brought in the things that David his father had dedicated, even the silver and gold and all the utensils, and put them in the treasuries of the house of God. Then Solomon assembled to Jerusalem the elders of Israel and all the heads of the tribes, the leaders of the fathers of the household of the sons of Israel, to bring the ark of the covenant of the Lord out of the city of David, which is Zion. All the men of Israel assembled themselves to the king at the feast, that is, in the 7th month. Then all the elders of Israel came, and the Levites took up the ark. They brought the ark in the tent of meeting, and all of the holy utensils which were in the tent, the Levitical priests brought them up. So the first thing that Solomon does when he gets the temple built is not only honor God, which is the whole reason he built the temple, but he also honors his father. By the first thing that he brings are the things that David had prepared for the temple. So he obviously knew how important this was to his father, and he wanted to make sure that the first thing he did was to get those into the temple. So it's 7 years later after he brought his whole assembly together, offered the 1,000 sacrifices, and then he brings that assembly back together again. All of the leaders of Israel, leaders of all the tribes, it names out who they are. Anybody that's in a leadership role, he brings them out for the dedication of the temple. He wants to make sure that they take part in making this ark have a permanent home. Verses 6 through 7. And King Solomon and all the congregation of Israel who were assembled with him before the ark were sacrificing so many sheep and oxen that they could not be counted or numbered. Then the priest brought the ark of the covenant of the Lord to its place, into the inner sanctuary of the house, to the Holy of Holies, under the wings of the cherubim. So in the chapters we've studied, we kind of see this back and forth between Solomon and God. Solomon gets appointed as king, and he shows his reverence for God by offering 1,000 sacrifices. God responds and he says, ask me for whatever you want. So Solomon asks for wisdom and knowledge. And so God grants him the wisdom and knowledge, but he also grants him additional wealth. And so Solomon turns around and takes all that wealth that God gave him, and he builds God a temple before he even builds his own house. And so then as he's honoring God by bringing it to him, God continues to bless Solomon. And then Solomon, as soon as he finished the temple, he comes again and offers sacrifices, just as he did before he started. And this time it didn't say 1,000, it said too many to be numbered. So I imagine that it's way more than 1,000, because if they could count 1,000, they would have counted it. So Solomon here is the perfect example of God blessing those who love him, whose hearts are in the right place. He didn't just bless Solomon because of what he did. He blessed Solomon because of where his heart was at the time. This is the time when Solomon was still very faithful to God. His intentions were never selfish. So when he honored God, God honored him back, and God blessed him. And he'll do the same thing for us. He promises that for us as well. But our heart is what he wants. It's not our actions. It's not coming to church. It's nothing like that. He wants our heart. He wants everything that we are to be dedicated to him. If we ask him for something, if it's a selfish reason, he's probably not going to give it to us. And that's what we saw with Solomon. When Solomon asked, Solomon didn't have selfish intentions. Solomon asked for things that were for the benefit of God and God's people. So that's where I wanted to end today. Next week, we'll pick up in chapter 6, and then we'll actually finish out the 2 remaining lessons, because we'll have the Lads to Leader program come in the following week, and then we'll do 2 weeks of a different lesson. Any more comments or discussions on today's lesson before we close? John, would you care to close us in prayer?
Yeah.